On the trail of Robert the Bruce brings me to the small town of Lochmaben, ancestral seat of the Bruces, bang in the heart of Bruce territory. It begins with a story that would not only seal the fate of the two primary men involved, but of the land and people of Scotland who lived under the shadow of an invader. It is about a struggle for power between those who had it and wanted to keep it, and those who aspired to more of it and were willing to take it. It culminates in the most heinous of crimes: sacrilege at the high altar of a holy place. Join me as we explore a murder that shocked the medieval world. To begin our story today, we take a look at this unremarkable piece of land here in the town of Lochmaben. This was the Mutton Bailey, the seat of the Bruce family. Now, the Bruce family in Annan, their home had been flooded and they relocated here to Lochmaben. And Robert the Bruce's grandfather, the competitor, he died here in the year 1295. So Robert the Bruce, our king, would have spent much of his childhood in this area here. Now, as I say, it looks unremarkable. It backs off onto Lochmaben golf course here. And this is July, it's very wet, and it's extremely green. The weeds are high. The time to come here and really view it as a Mutton Bailey, to see the earthworks, is in the autumn, when all this greenery starts to die down. But it's a significant place. This is the hub of the Bruce dynasty. So they would have been well acquainted with all the lands around here, and when the Bruces set up camp here and they would govern from here, Lochmaben became an extremely important place. It also became important in the Scottish Wars of Independence. We're going to look at the newer version of Lochmaben Castle, which would play significantly in the years to come. But this is the original castle of the Bruces in Lochmaben. This is the later Lochmaben Castle, built around 1299 by King Edward I. This replaced the old Bruce Motte and Bailey, and quite a substantial castle. Much of what remains in the brickwork today is late 14th century, but Bruce would have known this very well. And Edward I's strengthening of the castles here just show how valuable an area this was for English forces coming north. But also, what I find really intriguing, really important, is that when you look at the Bruce earldoms and lordships of Carrick and Annandale, where we are, they are surrounded by Comyn territory in all angles. That must have caused friction between the Bruce and the Comyn factions. The political backdrop leading up to the year 1306 was a hotbed. John Comyn, the Comyn family, had led the Scots into war with Edward in 1296. And from the turbulent years that followed, 1296 Dunbar, 1297 Stirling Bridge, 1298 Falkirk, Roslin in 1303 was a heavy time. So the Commons were the political leaders of the day. And gradually, as now the Bruces have submitted to Edward as early as 1302. So when we arrive at the year 1304, alliances, Scots alliances are coming into Edward's peace. And it would eventually be that the Commons would come into Edward's peace. The terms for those, the cost of that peace were, number one, that John Comyn, there would be no loss of life or limb. This was one of the terms, for many other people as well. Two, there would be no disinheritance or imprisonment for him. Number three, he would retain the lands of his heritage, which was important, of course, to the Comyn family, the Comyn political power at the time. But on condition that he be exiled from the country for 1 year. After the end of the siege of Stirling in 1304, King Edward had another condition. William Wallace had returned to Scotland and he was still active in the country in his insurrection. So he stipulated that Wallace had to be taken and handed over so that Edward could see how each man bared himself in their obligations to the king. Once Wallace was captured and executed, the terms were agreed. Once terms had been agreed, it did not satisfy, and it caused grievance with some Scots, but most notably with one Robert Bruce. What's interesting to note is that John Comyn, when John Comyn was negotiating for the submission of the Scots to Edward, he was negotiating with his brother-in-law, Edward's man, Aymer de Valence. Quite an interesting relationship they had there politically and on a personal level. But Robert Bruce had submitted to Edward long before John Comyn. Robert Bruce had fought for Edward. He had been sheriff of Ayr in Lanark. He had even participated in advisory capacities of the new system of things in Scotland. Robert the Bruce was not one of the 10 representatives elected for the Scottish realm. He had been squeezed out. That set even more of what was a bitter rivalry into the fray. The Comyns had vast political power and they wanted to keep it. The Bruces had an aspiration for more power than they currently had, and they wanted to take it. This was a severe blow to Robert the Bruce. Edward and the Commons both possessed suspicions of the Bruces. They knew as far back as 1299, when we know it came to blows at a meeting in Peebles, that Bruce had entered into a relationship, a political relationship with Bishop William Lamberton. John Comyn, when he attacked Bruce that day, accused Lamberton and Bruce of being in cahoots. Edward did not trust Bruce or Lamberton. Comyn did not trust Bruce or Lamberton. The political temperature was high and coming to the boil. Things were becoming politically desperate for the Bruces. And this is the backdrop that set events in motion for February 1306. Thomas Gray of the Scala Chronica says that Bruce had sent his brothers to Dalswinton at the other side of Dumfries. He sent his brothers here from Lochmaben to persuade them to come to a meeting. It doesn't say what that meeting was for, but we can guess. And this, if that story is true, we'll take a good look at it. But this is what sets the backdrop for an event, for a murder that would shock the medieval world. This morning I'm in the town of Dumfries. Dumfries. In the year 1306, more specifically, the 10th of February 1306, would be put on the map in the minds of people as a place where Robert the Bruce would make a change he was never able to return from. He would murder his rival in the Greyfriars Monastery in Dumfries. Now, this is a superb area. This is the River Nith. Quite a formidable river. Even today, as you can see, there are some logs trapped in the rapids there. What you see in front of you is the Devergilla Bridge. Lady Devergilla was responsible for the building of many of the abbeys and religious establishments around this area. She was mother to King John Balliol. She was grandmother to Edward Balliol. And not only did she build Sweetheart Abbey, this abbey and this bridge in the 1200s that you see before you. But over here, we're going to look at what modern changes have done to the place that Robert the Bruce and John Comyn would have known. But there are some gems. There are some gems still to explore. And we need to use our imagination and our minds for what stretched all the way down here to the River Nith. And straight ahead of us, all those buildings you can see, was the former home of the Greyfriars Monastery in Dumfries, where this infamous event would take place, and where Robert the Bruce would do something unimaginable, unthinkable. There was no greater crime. He would put an end to the life of the most powerful noble in Scotland, John the Red Comyn. I often wonder what was going through the mind of John Comyn when he made that fateful journey from his home at Dalswinton, a short way up the River Nith. As he made his way down the River Nith with his retinue, he was with people. He wouldn't have come to meet Robert Bruce alone. Far from it. And especially coming into Bruce territory. Bruce was here with friends, brothers probably, and given the history between the two of them, which was volatile to say the least, suspicion, caution, and some premeditated thoughts would have been going through the minds of both of them.
So what you can see in front of you from where the camera is, moving right to left, this was the property of the Greyfriars Monastery in Dumfries. It is bounded by Friars Venel, Castle Street, which we'll take a look at, and Buccleuch Street, up on the far left.
We're entering Friars Venel. Dumfries Castle is about barely a mile down that way, and that will also feature in today's story after the events take place here. So where we're coming to, this is Friars Venel. On my left hand side is the property of what was once Greyfriars Monastery. Now here's the interesting thing. Nothing remains except the foundations, which are under a few of the shops of Greyfriars Monastery. But an archaeological dig took place there in the year 1902. And what they found is thought to be the altar stone where Bruce put his rival to death. What they also found were a few skeletons with their heads resting against the stone, facing an east-west direction. Now these were thought to be clerics, monks, people who had some position in the monastery. And here's the interesting part for me. Nearby, they found another 2 skeletons. And they have thought to be the skeletons of Robert and John Comyn. Remember, this is a double murder. And they were interred after the dig was done. They are still there. Interestingly, I spoke to a man yesterday, a resident in the area, born and bred, and he spoke that away behind the White Hart Hotel, which is away at the bottom end there, but past it, all the way up underneath this area, are a series of tunnels. It's no surprise that old establishments would have had tunnels, especially during the Scottish Wars of Independence. It makes sense that they could store stuff, hide treasures, valuables, when word of an invader was coming through. The alignment of these buildings is approximately that of the early Greyfriars Monastery wall. As you reach the ridge on which the ancient borough stood, you will see the statue of Robert Burns overlooked by the elegant 180-foot spire of the Greyfriars new church. Now, where we're coming into now is Castle Street. And this is significant. It's 6 a.m. here, and I've picked this time just so it can be quiet. Now, unremarkably, popular store in our area, Greggs. Greggs is being refurbished. I did contact them. I did try to get access to underground and what they were doing here, but they weren't able to help me on this occasion. But here's the thing. This plaque here. Here stood the monastery of the Greyfriars, where on Thursday the 10th of February 1306, Robert the Bruce, aided by Sir Roger Kirkpatrick, slew the Red Comyn and opened the final stage of the war for Scottish independence, which ended victoriously on the field of Bannockburn 1314. Aye, Mac Sicker, erected by the citizens of Dumfries and the Saltire Society. It's amazing now to think, in this modern day built up area, that the most changing event in the life of Robert the Bruce took place. But we must be able to visualize, use your imaginations. What I do in my mind is I strip away all of this that I see. I take what remains and I build it in my mind, what it must have looked like. And when you do something like this regularly, you very much make your characters come alive. You build them up in your mind, and they become very real, even although 750 years ago or so. But these places under here, if you can see beyond the shops, the modern day establishments, these are historically significant places, and I always think more can be done to bring them to life, to make them alive. But this is where Robert the Bruce murdered his rival. Now this must have caused a huge uproar in the town. John Comyn was a famous man, as was Robert Bruce, but John Comyn was more powerful. He'd been put to death. The English justicers were holding a session in Dumfries that day, at the castle, and probably at various places in town as well. This would have caused such a stir, because that sword fight would have spilled out not only from Greyfriars Monastery, but out into the street. There would have been uproar. People would have been running, crying, shouting, spreading the news. Robert Bruce not only had committed an act of sacrilege, but he had to do something, and do it quickly. We've just come off Castle Street and we're now heading down to this is Buccleuch Street, an aptly named pub for the area, the Robert the Bruce, which is a Witherspoons. This is Buccleuch Street, and as I walk from the other side here, so this also bounded. This would have been the end of Greyfriars Monastery on the other side. Yesterday, I was in the middle there, walking amongst all those back streets, looking for some evidence, and there is some disturbed ground. There is some disturbed tarmac where it indicates that there could be tunnels in the area. And there's no reason to disbelieve the old guy. They are more than likely there, and most towns with a medieval history, look at Edinburgh, much of it is underground. But all of this here, whatever is under all this, I'm sure there's much evidence. There are certainly what is thought to be the bodies of Robert and John Comyn interred forevermore in here. And likely along with many more people who were physicians and had a love and affection and a life in the Greyfriars Monastery. Because we can't see with the eyes, It does not limit, and it should not limit, what we can see with our mind. And we must use our minds to bring our history to life. This is such a significant place when you're on the trail of Robert the Bruce. This is Bruce country, Bruce territory, the lordship of Annan. And this event was world news. This became world news. It stretched all the way from King Edward's message to the Pope, where he spoke about Robert the Bruce rose his head in treason, tried to get Sire John Comyn to side to him, but he would not, so that Robert could make himself King of Scotland. Here we come to the end of Buccleuch Street, and you'll see the Friars' Vaults just in front of us there. And this is the entire area that was taken up by Greyfriars Monastery. There are several accounts speaking how Comyn got to the Greyfriars Church and eventually met Bruce. Both Scottish and English accounts vary much in what they tell us. But what we do know is that Comyn did get there. One chronicler, the Florus Historiarum, tells us that Bruce was secretly and then openly declaring how he would fight the battles and free the kingdom from the English invader. When he proposed this to Comyn, this treason, Comyn refused. Threats were exchanged. Bruce struck him on the head and he went down. They wrestled for a while. Bruce's men intervened. Comyn managed to struggle away, get himself to the altar. Bruce pursued him, and then he stabbed him to death. That is one account. Forden, this gives it a real patriotic flavour. He has Bruce proposing his lands to Comyn in return for the kingship. Comyn refuses this. Again, threats are exchanged, and Bruce attacks Comyn. What many of the sources agree is that Comyn was killed in two stages. One where he's stabbed, but not fatally, or it's certainly not dead. And then where Bruce's men, one traditional saying is that Kirkpatrick, who was with Bruce had come out of the church. He says, "I doubt I have slain the Comyn." Kirkpatrick is reported to have said, "Doubt you say? Then I'll make sicker. I'll make sure." And he returned in with the rest of his men, and they buried their daggers in Comyn's body and finished him off. It's unlikely that Bruce would propose his lands to Comyn in return for the crown. It's unlikely that Comyn would ever agree to this. And it's also unlikely that Bruce would give him a vice versa argument, where you take all my lands and I have the crown. Bruce would not want all the Comyn lands and have Comyn king. Comyn would not want all the Bruce lands and have Bruce king. But we'll look more closely at what the other sources tell us before we draw our own conclusions. Both Hemingberra, Lanercost, and Thomas Gray state that Bruce dispatched his brothers, Thomas and Nigel to persuade Comyn to come to a meeting in the Greyfriars in Dumfries. But they were to fall upon Comyn on the way and kill him, because Comyn received them with such friendliness. They couldn't bring themselves to do it. So they arrived in Dumfries. And Robert had to do the job himself once he met Comyn in the church. Words have it that once he stabbed the Comyn and Bruce's men joined in Christopher Seaton, because this was a double murder. Robert Comyn was also killed, so he came to his nephew's aid. Christopher Seaton stabbed Robert Comyn to death. This is the double murder, and then a violent fight took place. How many were in each party, we do not know. What it said also, though, was that not only was Comyn unarmed, but Bruce had armour concealed underneath his clothes. He also concealed a dagger. It's likely, knowing the history of these two, which was a volatile one, they had come to blows before, that any weapons would have been handed over outside. Possible that there was no searches. Perhaps weapons were handed over, but Bruce has concealed armour, and Bruce has a concealed dagger. Food for thought. The Monk's Chronicle states that Robert Comyn attacked Robert the Bruce with his sword, but he failed to pierce his armour. And that's when he was cut down by Christopher Seaton. So it's obvious, to some extent, that Bruce was prepared for some sort of violent incident to take place. When I think about John Comyn, it wouldn't be right in this film not to pay some tribute to the man and only glorify Bruce and his murder of Comyn. John Comyn was a very influential man in Scotland, a very powerful noble, and he did a lot. He did much to resist the English invasion under Edward Plantagenet. John Comyn was present in the early battles. Dunbar, Falkirk, even defeated the English in 1303 in 3 moves in 1 day at the Battle of Roslin. He negotiated peace with Edward. He had dealings with Wallace that we know were not the best. He certainly did not get on with the House of Bruce. That is evident from the previous meetings and how volatile those meetings were. There were people, the Commons were people of power. And as I mentioned earlier in this film, they wanted to keep it. They wanted to keep that political advantage. The Bruces aspired for power. They schemed. And they were willing to do anything to take it. And once Robert Bruce was squeezed out of the political sway in the early 1300s, he was left, if he aspired to power, with very few options. And because John Comyn, who was never outlawed, the Comyns were never outlawed, came into Edward's peace, it was an impossible situation politically for Bruces to have an advantage. And Robert Bruce may have felt, putting his personal animosity for John Comyn aside, that his removal was the only way that the Bruces could make their bid for the throne. We know that they had the backing of Church. We know that Bruce was in cahoots with William Lamberton, a man greatly distrusted by not only King Edward, but by the Commons as well. Bishop Wishart, who was not a favourite of the king, was very quick to absolve Bruce of this murder. We'll speak about that in due course. And a coronation, very hurriedly set, only 6 weeks after this event, where Bruce would be crowned king. There are a few other events that would take place within that time. Whatever plan Robert the Bruce had, killing John Comyn was only the beginning. So further down the River Nith here, beyond both those bridges, is what's known as Castle Dykes Park in Dumfries Castle. That is the next stage, because Bruce didn't just kill his rival. He made an extremely bold move, a treasonous move that would set the clock in motion and change not only the life of himself, but of the House of Bruce, the entire House of Bruce, forevermore. Once word spread throughout the town that the Commons had been murdered, or certainly the awareness that there had been a major incident in the church, Bruce and his retinue of men made his way here, now to Dumfries Castle. Dumfries Castle was in Edward's care under the knight Sir Richard de Seward. He would have known Bruce well. He would have known Comyn well. They would all have known each other. But Richard Seward and his justiciars were holding court here at the castle. Now, this is reputedly the location of the castle, but there is another part that I believe was also part of the castle at the time that I would like to explore. Bruce arrived with his men. Now, this makes me wonder, because he arrived outside of the castle, and this obviously would have caused some sort of disturbance, and by the time Seward and his garrison, probably around 70 odd men, crossbowmen, bowmen and what have you, decided to capitulate to Bruce, because he threatened to burn the place to the ground. Now, that garrison surrendered. Their lives were spared and they were able to go south. I often wonder the conversation that Seward had as a man of authority when coming out of the castle past Bruce and exchanging words, because he had obviously come to a point of no return. This was Edward's royal castle. It had been built in stone since the year 1298. And it was a major assault on the king's authority. There was no going back. The castle surrendered. Bruce took the castle. The flag would have been unfurled, and the whole of Dumfries would have been in no doubt that Robert the Bruce had made his mark on the land and stamped his own authority in rebellion against English-held authority. Word would spread, and it would spread quickly. What you have here. Now, the castle was built in stone, but a large part of it would have been timber as well. And here you have on the steep slopes to the side, just to the other side of this mound. This is this goes back to Norman times, this mound. Is a quay right on the River Nith. And this would have been crucial. Look at the ramparts here. Ancient ramparts all around us. And this quay for the boats and the ships would have been essential to supplies coming out and into the castle. So attacking the castle would have meant likely more than one area. Not just one entry. You would have had the entry to the quay, the harbour as well. But when you look around, the castle grounds are quite extensive. So it was a major strategic point, both for supplies. The River Nith can be wild. It can be a treacherous river. So it's essential that medieval water vessels would come up here and be able to supply this garrison. And for a garrison of 70 odd men, maybe including their officers, very competent archers and crossbowmen, to surrender to Bruce, sounds to me that Bruce would have had more than just a few men with him. He may have had men dotted around Dumfries at the time. He may have had men positioned near the castle. We don't know. But this castle would not have given way to a select few. News of Bruce's killing of Comyn would have spread quickly, but it would have taken a couple of weeks to reach King Edward I in England. Not only in the murder of Comyn, but with Bruce taking a castle, a royal castle. Edward I stayed here when he visited this area. So when Richard Seward and his garrison of English soldiers headed south, probably to Carlisle, and the news spread that there was a new rebellion in Scotland under Robert the Bruce, under the Bruce family, for they all aided him. The English were no strangers to rebellions breaking out. But this would have infuriated Edward. Edward knew Bruce well. At one time in his life, he was particularly fond of Robert Bruce. Maybe he saw some qualities in Bruce that were akin to himself. But being a man of ambition, being a warlord, being a military leader, a strategic thinker, a great commander, Edward was all of these things. Maybe he saw something of all of those qualities in Bruce, and that's why Bruce was such a threat. That's why caution and suspicion reigned when the Commons and English authorities thought about Robert Bruce. So confirmation of their suspicions when Bruce raised the flag. Not just for Scottish independence. Remember, this is about pragmatism. This is about the Bruce quest. An independent Scotland without Bruce being a part of it was no good to him. His version of Scotland, which would ultimately benefit us all, is what Bruce was after. It was a personal ambition, as well as one that had been drummed into him since childhood through his father, his grandfather in the House of Bruce, the Celtic line that his mother came from. But there's one thing about that when Edward heard news of this, not only would he be shocked at Comyn's murder, but the affront, the personal slap in the face with taking one of Edward's castles. That is the real affront to authority that would have set in motion a hunt, the declaration of a rebel, a man who would eventually be excommunicated and hunted like a dog in the heather, mocked and known as King Hob. But a man who would show extraordinarily resilience in coming back against impossible odds and firmly establishing the name of Bruce forevermore in the Scottish history books. What could have been occupying John Comyn's mind as he made his way along the other side of this river, the River Nith, going towards Dumfries, for his meeting with Robert Bruce? He was not ignorant of the situation between him and Bruce. He wasn't ignorant of both the personal and the political situation. Perhaps the Bruce brothers did go, and there was such a thing as a lure in order to kill him. But Comyn, being no fool, and probably a very able fighter himself, he'd fought in many battles, and it was an impossible task. Barber has Comyn reveal to Edward the treachery of Robert Bruce. He tells of this indenture which Edward confronts Bruce with, and Bruce is saved by a message from Gloucester where he is given spurs and a coin to make haste. And he also meets a messenger at the border, a messenger with a copy of the indenture in order to reveal him to Edward, to reveal that treason. He confronts Comyn with it. Again, words are exchanged, and finally the fight ensues and death occurs. If Comyn was difficult to get to, if it was difficult to get Comyn alone, assuming it was a premeditated murder, then the church would have been perfect, the perfect place to do it. He comes with his retinue, they meet outside, weapons are laid to the side, the other parties, the Bruce and the Comyn party, remain outside, and Bruce and Comyn enter the church to sort out a certain business. But Bruce has armour concealed under his clothes. He certainly has a dagger concealed. When Robert Comyn attacked Bruce, it said he was unable to pierce his armour, and of course he was cut down by Christopher Seaton. Comyn unarmed, in good faith, he's left his weapons at the door, but Bruce smuggles in a dagger. What else would they need it for? Not protection. Bruce hurries, after taking Dumfries Castle, hurries to Bishop Wishart in Glasgow, who's extremely quick in absolving Bruce of his crimes, and not only that, supplies him with robes and regalia of such like, so that they can very quickly, within 6 weeks, arrange a coronation to get him named King of Scots. By the time this word reached Edward, and by the time it reached the Pope, excommunication would take some time. But excommunication against ambition and risk can be a byproduct. I think the murder was first in a series of plans, including the taking of Dumfries Castle, Lochmaben Castle, the coronation, and 6 weeks later. I believe the murder was at the beginning of all those plans that were set in motion by the murder. That these things were not chance happenings, they were not hurried happenings, they were not something that happened because of something else, that they were all pre-planned. When Bruce made a very calculated move in his bid for the throne, for Robert the Bruce, it was now or never. It is said that despite Robert the Bruce's intelligence, despite him being quite an astute and prudent man, he also had an imperious temper. I think, this is my theory, and I neither side with the Scots or English theories. I try to read between the lines and come to my own conclusions. I think once Bruce was squeezed out of political affairs, or minimised, suppressed as much as possible, that he was in a risk-all situation. And I think he went to the Greyfriars that day to assassinate John Comyn. The main ambition of the Bruces was to topple or dislodge Comyn power. There's no way, and he knew it, that the Commons would agree to anything, especially kingship, that the Bruce may propose for him. I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell that that would happen. I also do not think that Bruce would make such an offer where he would give Comyn all his lands in return to support him being king, or vice versa. I don't think there's enough in that for John Comyn, and I think that Bruce would think that that would be a futile proposal. I think the only thing that was left for Bruce to do, if he was going to realise his ambition, was to get rid of John Comyn, his rival. In doing so, he would make many enemies. Many enemies. Why would he, on the cuff, straight after that murder, outside, say, right, let's take Dumfries Castle. Let's fly the flag from there and start our resistance? Was the coronation prearranged before the Comyn murder? Was it just time for them to make their move because Bruce had the backing of Lamberton and Wishart? Good questions. Questions that beg an insight, they beg an answer. I think Robert Bruce took his chances. He was prepared to risk all in a do or die effort. The costs would be heavy for him and his family and anyone who supported him. And it would take him years to realise his ambition. But he did. He did, against impossible odds. He did. He was not a stupid man, but ambition, burning desire, makes us do strange things. And when John Comyn made that trip along the Nith into Dumfries that day, I don't think he was entirely stupid as to how volatile the situation might be. He may have been curious as to what Bruce wanted to say to him, why he wanted to meet. And Bruce picks the one place that Comyn would think of all places, not only where he would be safe, but in the holy place, with an English garrison town and castle. Surely Bruce wouldn't try anything there. It's a great story. I would love to hear your answers on what really went down in Greyfriars Kirk between Bruce and Comyn. But the one conclusive thing above it all, he murdered them. Of that there's no doubt. The rest is history. But it was the murder that reverberated around the world. It was the murder that shocked the medieval world.